The welding torch sputtered and died in Roy Fletcher's hand for the third time that hour. He cursed under his breath and tossed it onto the workbench, watching it clatter among the scattered tools and metal scraps. The mining drone in front of him looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by something with very large teeth, which, according to the report, was exactly what happened when it got too close to one of the gas giant's storm systems. Roy wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced around his repair bay. The space was barely large enough for one person and whatever broken machine needed fixing. Spare parts hung from magnetic strips on the walls. Old coffee cups sat forgotten on every available surface. A small window showed the swirling orange and red clouds of the gas giant below, hypnotic and endless. Waypoint 7 wasn't much to look at. The orbital station served as a rest stop for miners, traders, and anyone else crazy enough to work the frontier territories. Most species passed through quickly, staying just long enough to refuel or repair their ships before heading back to civilization. Roy had been here for 2 years. He told himself it was temporary. Everyone told themselves that. He picked up a different torch and was about to restart his work when the communication panel on the wall crackled to life. But instead of a voice or a message, it produced a sound Roy had never heard before. It was rhythmic, like breathing or a heartbeat, but translated into electronic pulses. The pattern repeated itself over and over, rising and falling in waves. Roy walked to the panel and checked the frequency. It wasn't coming through any of the standard channels. The signal originated somewhere outside the station, somewhere close. He ran a quick diagnostic. Everything showed normal except for this one strange transmission that nobody else seemed to be picking up. He switched to the station's main channel. Fletcher here. Anyone else getting a weird signal on the lower frequencies? Static answered him for a moment before a bored voice replied, "Negative, Fletcher. All channels clear. You need to clean your receivers again." Roy frowned. His equipment was old but functional. He'd maintained it himself and it worked just fine. He went back to the strange signal and listened more carefully. There was something deliberate about it, something that felt less like interference and more like purpose. It reminded him of old Earth stories about whales singing to each other across vast oceans, calling out in languages humans could barely understand. He pulled up the navigation charts and started triangulating the source. The signal came from Valdris Minor, one of the small moons orbiting the gas giant. Roy knew that moon. Everyone knew to avoid it. Geologically unstable, covered in sulfur vents and crystal formations that played havoc with instruments. The mining companies had marked it as off-limits years ago after losing 2 survey teams to sudden quakes. But the signal kept calling. Roy turned away from it and tried to focus on the mining drone. He managed to work for almost 10 minutes before his eyes drifted back to the communication panel. The signal hadn't changed. It just kept repeating, patient and persistent, like someone tapping the same message over and over, hoping anyone would hear. Roy set down his tools. He knew he should ignore it. Probably just some natural phenomenon, some weird interaction between the moon's crystals and radiation from the gas giant. That's what any sensible person would think. But Roy had spent the last 2 years fixing machines in isolation, and sensible thinking didn't explain why his chest felt tight every time he heard that signal. He left the repair bay and walked down the narrow corridors of Waypoint 7. The station smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaner. He passed a group of miners arguing in a language he didn't recognize, stepped around a maintenance robot scrubbing the floor, and eventually reached the docking section where his shuttle sat waiting. The shuttle was small, designed for short trips between the station and nearby locations. Roy used it maybe once a month to pick up supplies from incoming freighters. He ran a quick systems check. Everything showed green. Fuel was good. Life support was good. He could make it to Valdris Minor and back with power to spare. His supervisor would ask questions. Station protocols required filing a flight plan and getting approval before leaving. But Roy had checked the schedule. His supervisor was currently 3 drinks deep at the station bar and wouldn't notice anything for at least a few hours. By then, Roy would already be back, probably with nothing to show for it except confirmation that he'd wasted fuel chasing ghosts. He climbed into the shuttle and sealed the hatch behind him. The cockpit was cramped but familiar. He'd made enough repairs to this small ship that he knew every wire and panel by touch. He powered up the engines and requested departure clearance from station control. They granted it without question. One more small ship leaving the station was nothing unusual. Roy guided the shuttle away from Waypoint 7's docking bay and into open space. The gas giant filled half his view, beautiful and terrible in its immensity. Valdris Minor appeared as a small gray dot against that backdrop. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. He set a course and engaged the engines. The signal grew stronger as he approached the moon. It felt like flying toward something ancient and important, though Roy couldn't explain why. He wasn't a spiritual person. He believed in what he could touch and fix and understand. But this felt different. This felt like someone calling out in the dark, hoping against hope that anyone would answer. The binary suns of the system began to set behind the gas giant, casting long shadows across space. Roy Fletcher flew alone toward a forbidden moon, chasing a signal that shouldn't exist, driven by something he couldn't name. In his experience, curiosity usually led to trouble. But sometimes, he thought, trouble was better than sitting still and letting the universe pass by unnoticed. The moon grew larger in his viewport. Soon he would have his answers. The shuttle's landing struts crunched against loose rock as Roy brought the small ship down in a clearing, between two jagged crystal formations. Valdris Minor looked even worse up close than it did from orbit. The ground was a patchwork of gray stone and rust-colored mineral deposits. Sulfur vents hissed in the distance, releasing yellow clouds that drifted sideways in the thin atmosphere. Roy checked his suit's oxygen levels and life support systems before cycling through the airlock. The air outside was technically breathable but tasted like rotten eggs and metal. He grimaced behind his helmet and activated the suit's filtration system. The heads-up display showed his position relative to the signal source. 2 kilometers northeast, deep in a canyon system that cut through the moon's crust like wounds. The walk was harder than he expected. The ground shifted under his boots with every step, and twice he had to detour around fissures that dropped into darkness. His instruments went haywire whenever he passed near the larger crystal formations. The compass spun wildly. The radiation detector clicked rapidly, then fell silent, then clicked again. Nothing about this place made sense. Roy reached the edge of the main canyon and looked down. The walls dropped at least 50 meters, lined with layers of different colored stone that told a geological story he couldn't read. At the bottom, more crystals jutted from the ground like frozen lightning. Some glowed with a faint blue light that had nothing to do with the setting suns. He found a path down. More of a controlled slide than a proper descent. Loose rocks skittered ahead of him, bouncing off crystal formations and disappearing into crevices. By the time he reached the canyon floor, his suit was scraped and dirty, and his breathing came harder than it should have. The signal was close now. Roy could feel it more than hear it, a pressure in his chest that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He followed the canyon deeper, squeezing through narrow passages and climbing over fallen boulders. The walls closed in around him, blocking out most of the remaining sunlight. Then he saw the marks, long gouges cut into the stone walls running parallel in groups of 4. Each groove was as wide as Roy's arm and deep enough to fit his whole hand inside. Something massive had dragged claws through solid rock, and the marks looked old, really old. The edges had weathered smooth and dust had settled into the deepest parts. Roy kept walking and found more signs. Scorched stone where intense heat had melted the surface. Impact craters where something heavy had struck the ground repeatedly. And paintings, faded but still visible on the protected parts of the canyon walls. They showed figures flying among stars, creatures with wings and long tails, beings that looked like they belonged in ancient myths rather than on a forgotten moon. The canyon opened into a cavern, and Roy stopped walking. His helmet light swept across the interior, revealing a space large enough to fit several cargo ships. The walls were covered in crystals that glowed with their own inner light, blue and green and purple, casting strange shadows that seemed to move and breathe. And in the center of the cavern, she lay dying. Roy had seen big things before. He'd worked on mining vessels the size of city blocks and stood beneath the curved hull of a passenger liner during repairs. But this was different. This was alive. The creature stretched across the cavern floor, her body easily as long as a cargo freighter. Scales covered her hide, each one the size of Roy's hand, and even in the dim light they seemed to shimmer with colors that hurt to look at directly. Colors that reminded him of deep space and distant nebulas and things too far away to touch. Wings lay folded against her sides, translucent membranes stretched between elongated bone structures. Her head rested on the stone floor, eyes closed, breathing shallow and labored, and through her torso, pinning her to the ground like some cruel specimen, A massive shard of crystallized material glowed with an unnatural light. Roy's legs felt weak. His training said to run, to get back to the shuttle and leave this place and never speak of what he'd seen. But he couldn't move. He could only stare at this impossible thing that shouldn't exist. Then her eye opened, just one, the size of Roy's entire helmet, and it focused on him with an intelligence that made his breath catch. The eye was gold and silver and colors that had no names, swirling like storm systems on the gas giant but contained in a space smaller than his fist. A voice spoke inside Roy's head. Not in his ears, but directly into his thoughts, bypassing language entirely. It was old and tired and carried weight that made Roy's knees want to buckle. "You heard me." Roy tried to speak, but his throat had gone dry. He managed a nod instead. "I did not think anyone would come. I have called for so long." The voice paused, and Roy felt the creature's exhaustion like a physical thing pressing down on the cavern. "What manner of being are you?" "Human," Roy said finally, his voice cracking. "My name is Roy Fletcher. I'm from Earth. I picked up your signal from the station." "Human." The word echoed in Roy's mind as the creature tasted it, examining it from all angles. "I do not know this species. The galaxy has changed much since I last flew among the stars. How long have you been here?" 300 of your years, perhaps more. Time moves strangely when one is dying. I fought in the last war, and I fell here, and I have waited. The great eye studied Roy carefully. "I am called Thesara. I am the last of the star dragons, and I was not calling for rescue, small human. I was calling for someone to witness my passing, to remember that we existed, so that we do not disappear entirely from the universe." Roy looked at the massive shard piercing through Thesara's body, at the wound that had festered for 3 centuries, at the proud creature brought low by ancient violence. He thought about his daughter, about loss and loneliness and the terrible weight of being the last of something precious. "I'm here now," he said quietly. "You're not alone anymore." Roy circled the shard slowly, his helmet light catching the strange material from different angles. It wasn't metal or stone or anything he recognized from standard material charts. The crystallized structure pulsed with a faint inner glow, and his radiation detector screamed warnings every time he got close. Antimatter. Someone had weaponized antimatter and turned it into a physical object, then used it to pierce through a living creature. "You should leave," Thesara said into his mind. Her voice was weaker now. As if speaking took energy she could barely spare. "The shard releases small amounts continuously. It prevents my body from healing, keeps the wound open. I have tried to remove it myself for 3 centuries. It cannot be done." Roy knelt beside the wound and examined where the shard entered her body. The scales around it had blackened and cracked. Flesh that should have healed long ago remained torn and weeping. The shard had embedded itself deep, probably reaching her vital organs. Maybe her heart, if dragons had hearts in the same way other creatures did. "What happens if I try to pull it out?" Roy asked. "The containment structure will collapse. The antimatter will react with normal matter in an uncontrolled cascade. We will both die instantly, along with everything in a radius of several kilometers." Thesara's eye fixed on him. "This is why you must leave. There is no solution here. Only death waiting to happen." Roy stood and walked back to the cavern entrance where he could still see his shuttle in the distance. He could climb back up the canyon, return to the station, report what he'd found. Scientists would probably want to study Thesara from a safe distance. Maybe they'd try to help. Probably they'd just document everything and wait for her to die naturally, so they could examine the remains. He thought about his daughter again. She'd been 7 when the colony transport suffered a catastrophic failure. Explosive decompression. The entire family section gone in seconds. Roy had been on a different part of the ship, working in the engine bay when it happened. He'd survived. They hadn't. And for 2 years he'd been fixing broken machines in the middle of nowhere, trying not to think about things he couldn't fix. Roy turned around and walked back to Thesara. "How big is the antimatter core?" "You are not listening, small human. There is no way to remove it safely." "That wasn't my question." "How big is the core?" Thesara was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps the size of your closed fist. The crystalline structure surrounding it is much larger, designed to release the antimatter slowly over time, a weapon meant to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death." Roy nodded. He was already doing calculations in his head. thinking about magnetic containment fields and the equipment he had available. And if we could stabilize the containment structure while removing it, stop the antimatter from reacting with anything until we get it into a proper containment unit? Impossible. The forces required would crush the shard and trigger the cascade. Not if we use multiple magnetic field generators positioned correctly, distribute the force evenly, support the structure from all sides while we cut it free. Roy started pacing, his mind working through the problem like any other mechanical challenge. I'd need to get equipment from my shuttle, and probably some additional parts from the station. Human. Roy Fletcher. Thesara's voice grew stronger, almost angry. I have existed for thousands of your years. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have watched stars be born and die. Do not think you can solve in moments what I have contemplated for centuries. Roy stopped pacing and looked at the dragon. Really looked at her. He saw the ancient wisdom in her eye, but he also saw the resignation. She'd given up, not because the problem was impossible, but because she'd been alone with it for so long that she'd convinced herself nothing could change. Maybe you're right, Roy said quietly. Maybe I'm just some human mechanic who doesn't know when to quit. But I've been working with machines and problems my whole life, and I learned something important. Most things aren't impossible. They're just hard. And the difference between those two words is whether you're willing to try. He headed toward the cavern entrance. I'm going back to my shuttle to get my equipment. I'll be back in a few hours. Try not to die before then. Thesara's mental voice followed him. Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing. We have only just met. Roy paused at the entrance and looked back at the massive creature pinned to the cavern floor. My daughter loved stories about dragons. She used to make me tell her one every night before bed. I told her dragons were brave and strong and magical. I told her they helped people and protected things that mattered. His voice cracked slightly. She died 2 years ago and I couldn't help her. Couldn't protect her. Couldn't fix what went wrong. But maybe I can help you. And maybe that means something. He didn't wait for a response. The climb back up the canyon was faster than the descent, driven by purpose and the kind of stubborn determination that had kept him alive this long. By the time he reached his shuttle, he'd already planned out what he needed and how he'd get it. The binary suns had set completely now. Valdris Minor lay in darkness except for the faint glow from the gas giant and the distant stars. Roy powered up his shuttle systems and opened a communication channel to Waypoint 7. Fletcher to Station Control. I need to make a supply run. Emergency repair situation. I'll need access to the industrial equipment lockers. Copy that, Fletcher. What kind of emergency? Roy looked at the canyon where an impossible creature waited to die. The kind that needs magnetic containment units and a lot of welding wire. I'll explain when I get back. He didn't mention the dragon. Some things people wouldn't believe until they saw them with their own eyes. And some things were worth keeping quiet until you knew whether your crazy plan would work or just get everyone killed. Roy fired up the engines and lifted off from Valdris Minor, already composing a mental list of everything he'd need to pull off the most important repair job of his life. The magnetic field generators sat in a circle around Thesara's wound, connected by a web of cables that Roy had spent 6 hours running and testing. Each generator was designed for mining operations, used to separate valuable metals from asteroid debris. Roy had never seen anyone use them for medical purposes. Then again, he'd never seen anyone try to save a dragon before. Roy wiped his forehead with the back of his glove and checked his readings for the 20th time. All 6 generators showed green. Power flow was steady. The magnetic fields overlapped precisely at the center point, where the antimatter shard pierced through Thesara's body. In theory, when he activated them, the fields would create a stable pocket that would hold the shard in place even as he cut away the crystalline structure around the antimatter core. In theory. You have worked without rest, Thesara observed. Her voice in his mind was softer now, less confrontational. This stubbornness is a curious trait. It's called determination, Roy said. He picked up the cutting torch and tested the flame. Blue and hot, designed to slice through starship hull plating, or stupidity. People argue about which one I have more of. Your hands shake. Roy looked at his gloves. She was right. A fine tremor ran through his fingers, fatigue and stress combining into something he couldn't quite control. He set down the torch and flexed his hands, trying to work feeling back into them. I have not thanked you, Thesara said. Even if this fails, even if we both die here, you tried when no one else would have bothered. My species forgot how to do that. We forgot how to help when helping was difficult. What happened to the other dragons? Roy asked. He sat down beside one of the generators, taking a moment to rest before beginning the actual procedure. You said you were in a war. We fought each other. Pride and territory and old grudges that should have been forgotten long ago. Star dragons once traveled between galaxies, helping young species learn to reach the stars. We taught and guided and protected, but we grew arrogant. We believed our age and power made us superior to those we helped. Tessara's eye closed. The young species grew strong and no longer needed us. Some resented us. We should have stepped back gracefully. Instead, we fought among ourselves over what role we should play. The war lasted 300 years. By the end, there were so few of us left that we could not sustain a population. We scattered to die alone, too proud to comfort each other. Roy thought about humanity, young and aggressive and pushing out into a galaxy full of older species who looked at them with suspicion. Sounds familiar. Humans aren't great at learning from other people's mistakes. Perhaps, but you are here, trying to save someone you do not know, risking your life for no reward. That suggests some wisdom. The great eye opened again. If you survive this, tell your species about us. Let them learn from our failure. Pride is a slow poison. I will, Roy said. He stood and picked up the cutting torch again. His hand still trembled, but he'd worked through worse conditions. Ready? As ready as one can be for probable death. Roy activated the magnetic field generators. The air around the shard shimmered as invisible forces locked into place. His instrument showed the containment field holding steady, cradling the antimatter structure in a pocket of controlled energy. So far, so good. He brought the cutting torch to the base of the shard and started working. The crystalline structure was harder than any material he'd cut before. The torch's flame barely scratched the surface. Roy adjusted the temperature higher and tried again. Slowly, carefully, a thin line appeared where the torch touched. Sweat ran down his face inside the helmet. His arms ached from holding the torch steady. Each cut had to be perfect. Too deep and he'd damage the antimatter core. Too shallow and the structure wouldn't separate. He worked in silence except for his own breathing and the hiss of the cutting torch. An hour passed. Then 2. The crystalline structure gradually separated from the surrounding tissue. Tessara remained perfectly still, barely breathing, her entire body locked in place to avoid any movement that might disrupt Roy's work. Then one of the magnetic generators sputtered. The power flow dropped from green to yellow. The containment field flickered. Problem, Roy said. He killed the torch and ran to the failing generator. The display showed a burned-out coupling, the kind of failure that happened when equipment ran too hot for too long. He had maybe 5 minutes before the generator shut down completely. Without it, the containment field would collapse asymmetrically, and the antimatter would start reacting. Leave, Tessara said urgently. Get to your shuttle. You can still survive this. Not happening. Roy sprinted toward the cavern entrance. His shuttle sat where he'd left it, powered down but intact. He'd stripped half the navigation systems to reinforce the generators. Now he needed to strip more. Roy tore open the shuttle's access panels and ripped out the main navigation computer. The entire guidance system came free in his hands. A dense block of processors and memory cores worth more than his shuttle itself. He ran back to the cavern, legs burning, lungs aching in the thin atmosphere. 3 minutes left, maybe less. He slammed the navigation computer into place beside the failing generator and started rewiring connections. His fingers moved on instinct. Muscle memory from thousands of repairs guiding him when conscious thought was too slow. Red wire to power conduit. Blue wire to magnetic coil. Ground the entire system through the backup circuit. The failing generator died. For one terrible second, the containment field collapsed on that side. The antimatter shard shifted, tilted, started to react. Then the navigation computer came online. It wasn't designed to generate magnetic fields, but it could process and redirect power. Roy had turned it into an improvised replacement, a patch job that would make any proper engineer scream. The containment field stabilized. The shard stopped moving. Roy collapsed to his knees, gasping. His shuttle was dead now. The navigation computer was fried beyond repair. He was stranded on this moon with no way home. But the field was holding. You sacrificed your escape, Tessara said softly. Yeah. Roy picked up the cutting torch with shaking hands. Guess I'm committed now. Let's finish this. 4 days after the extraction, Roy sat cross-legged beside Thessara's healing wound and watched scales slowly knit themselves back together. The antimatter core sat safely contained in a makeshift unit, cobbled together from his shuttle's reactor shielding, glowing faintly behind triple-layered magnetic fields. It would need proper disposal eventually, but for now it was stable and far away from the dragon's body. The wound itself looked better than Roy had dared hope. What had been a festering crater of blackened flesh was now closing from the edges inward, new tissue growing to replace what the antimatter had destroyed. Thessara's natural healing was working faster than anything Roy had seen in any species. Within a week, maybe less, the external wound would be completely sealed. "Tell me about your daughter," Thessara said. She'd been speaking more over the past few days, sharing stories and asking questions. The silence of 300 years was being broken one conversation at a time. Roy leaned back against the cavern wall. Her name was Beth. She was 7. Smart as anything, always asking questions I couldn't answer. She wanted to be a pilot like her mother. He smiled at the memory. She'd make these elaborate drawings of ships she was going to fly someday. Most of them had way too many engines and probably couldn't actually fly, but she didn't care. You miss her greatly. Every day. Roy picked up a small rock and turned it over in his hands. I've been running from that for 2 years. Took jobs in places nobody wants to go. Kept myself busy with repairs and maintenance. Figured if I stayed busy enough it wouldn't hurt so much. Did it work? No. Roy tossed the rock aside. Just made me lonely and tired. But I didn't know what else to do. Thessara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her mental voice carried something Roy hadn't heard before. Sadness. Deep and old and vast. I understand. When the last of my kind died, I came here to hide. I told myself I was wounded, that I needed to heal. But the truth is I was running too, from the shame of what we had become, from the failure of our species. I convinced myself I wanted to die alone rather than face a galaxy that no longer needed star dragons. But you called out, Roy said. That signal. You were asking for help. I was asking for witness, for someone to remember. Thessara's eye focused on him. But you gave me something different. You gave me a reason to continue. Do you know what that is worth? Roy shook his head. Everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Roy checked the containment unit readings and adjusted one of the magnetic field generators. His engineering supplies were running low. Food was getting scarce too. He'd stretched his rations as far as they would go, but eventually he'd need rescue. The problem was explaining why he needed rescue from a restricted moon without mentioning the dragon. I need to tell you something, Thessara said. A gift, but also a burden. She shifted her position slightly and Roy heard scales sliding against stone. One of the scales near her chest, right over where her heart would be, had come loose during the healing process. It was the size of Roy's hand, iridescent and beautiful, swirling with colors that seemed to shift when he looked at them from different angles. Take it, Thessara said. Press it to your forehead. Roy picked up the scale carefully. It was lighter than he expected, warm to the touch. He did as instructed and pressed it against his forehead above his eyes. Information flooded into his mind. Not words or images, but pure knowledge. He saw the history of the galaxy, from a perspective millions of years old. He learned about species that had risen to greatness and fallen into dust long before humanity discovered fire. He understood technologies that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years, mathematics that described the universe in ways human science hadn't imagined yet. It lasted only seconds, but Roy staggered backward and sat down hard. His head spun with the weight of what he'd just received. What did you do? I gave you the last library of the Star Dragons. Everything we learned, everything we discovered, everything we should have shared but hoarded out of pride. It is encoded in quantum states within the scale structure. Your human scientists will need centuries to fully decode it. But the knowledge is there. Roy looked at the scale in his hands with new understanding. This wasn't just a gift. This was responsibility. Why me? Because you tried when trying was difficult. Because you helped when helping was dangerous. Because you are what we should have been. Thessara's voice grew serious. But I must warn you, the galaxy is changing. Old powers are waking. Young species are reaching maturity and testing their strength. The mistakes my kind made, the wars we fought, the pride that destroyed us, all of these things I see beginning in others. Your species included. What do I do with this? Share it, teach, guide, show your species and others that there is a different path. We star dragons were meant to be teachers, but we forgot that lesson ourselves. Perhaps humanity can do better. Roy stood and walked to the cavern entrance. The binary suns were rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He thought about going home, about facing other humans with this impossible story and this precious burden. He thought about Beth and whether she'd be proud of what her father had become. "The galaxy will think I'm crazy," he said. "Probably. Humans are not known for their belief in ancient myths made real. And when I show them the scale, when scientists confirm what's in it, they'll want to study you. They'll want to take samples and run tests and treat you like a specimen." "Let them try," Thesara said, and Roy heard amusement in her mental voice. "I am feeling much better now. I do not think I will be easy to study against my will." Roy laughed. It felt good, the first real laugh in 2 years. "We're going to cause quite a stir." "Good, the galaxy has been too quiet for too long. Time to wake everyone up." Thesara spread her wings for the first time in 3 centuries, and the sound was like thunder rolling through the canyon. The membrane stretched between bone and muscle caught the light from the binary suns, casting colored shadows across the stone walls. She tested each wing carefully, feeling strength return to muscles that had atrophied during her long imprisonment. Roy watched from beside his dead shuttle and felt his breath catch. This was what she was meant to be, not a dying creature pinned to a cavern floor, but something magnificent and powerful and ancient beyond human comprehension. The wound in her chest had sealed completely, leaving only a faint line of newer scales to mark where the antimatter shard had pierced her. "Can you fly?" Roy asked. Thesara crouched low and then launched herself upward. Her wings caught the thin atmosphere and pulled her into the sky with grace that defied her massive size. She circled the canyon once, twice, climbing higher with each pass. Roy could feel her joy through their mental connection, pure and unfiltered after so long trapped and helpless. She landed beside him gently, careful not to crush him with her bulk. "I can fly. I can hunt. I can travel between worlds again." She lowered her head until her eye was level with Roy's face. "And I will not abandon the one who gave me back the sky." "I was wondering about that," Roy said. He looked at his shuttle, stripped of parts and completely non-functional. "I've got maybe 2 days of life support left in my suit. Food ran out yesterday. I need to get back to waypoint 7 somehow, and I don't think walking is an option. I will carry you." Roy had expected that answer, but still felt his stomach drop at the thought. "I've never flown before. Not like this. Not without a ship around me. Trust me as I trusted you." Roy couldn't argue with that. He gathered what remained of his equipment, secured the containment unit holding the antimatter core, and tried not to think too hard about what he was about to do. Thesara extended one foreleg and Roy climbed onto her back. Her scales provided natural handholds, and there was a spot between her shoulders where he could sit relatively comfortably. "Hold tight," Thesara said. She didn't give him time to prepare. With a powerful leap and 2 massive beats of her wings, they were airborne. Roy grabbed onto the nearest scale ridge and held on as the ground dropped away beneath them. The thin atmosphere screamed past his helmet. His stomach lurched as Thesara banked hard and shot toward the sky. Then they broke through the atmosphere into open space, and Roy forgot to breathe. He'd been in space thousands of times, always inside ships or stations, always with metal and glass between him and the void. But this was different. This was flying, truly flying, held onto the back of a living creature as she moved between worlds with the grace of something born to it. Thesara's wings still moved in space, not for propulsion but for steering. She used them to catch solar winds and gravitational fields, to surf the invisible currents that flowed between planets and moons. Roy watched Valdris Minor shrink behind them, and the gas giant grow larger ahead. The binary suns blazed to his left, and beyond them stretched the infinite darkness filled with stars. "This is how we traveled," Thesara said, "before ships and engines and artificial gravity. We flew between stars on wings and will alone. The young species looked up and saw us in their skies and called us gods. We should have told them we were simply older, not better." Waypoint 7 appeared ahead, a small cluster of metal modules orbiting the gas giant. Roy could see ships docked at the station and lights in the windows. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a human mechanic was riding a star dragon through space. "They're going to panic," Roy said. "Yes. Security will probably try to shoot at you. Let them try. I have survived worse than primitive weapons. Thessra angled toward the station, her approach slow and deliberate. Roy activated his suit's communication system. Waypoint 7, this is Roy Fletcher. I'm incoming on an unusual transport. Please don't shoot. I repeat, do not shoot. Static answered him, then a confused voice. Fletcher? Where the hell have you been? Your shuttle's been missing for over a week. And what do you mean, unusual transport? Look out your windows, Roy said. He imagined the scene inside the station as people pressed against viewports and saw what was coming. A creature of myth and legend, approaching their small frontier station with a human riding on her back. The communication channel erupted with voices talking over each other, shouting questions and warnings. Everyone calm down, Roy said. Her name is Thessara. She's friendly. She's also the last of an ancient species called star dragons, and she has a story that the galaxy needs to hear. Are you insane, Fletcher? Probably, but I'm also right. Thessara reached the station and grasped onto one of the docking arms with her claws, careful not to damage the structure. She positioned herself where every viewport could see her clearly. Then she spoke, not into Roy's mind alone, but into every communication device on the station. Every radio, every computer, every helmet and tablet and screen suddenly carried her voice. I am Thessara, last of the star dragons. 300 years ago I fell in this system, wounded in a war that destroyed my species. I waited for death alone until this human heard my call and refused to let me die. His name is Roy Fletcher, and he represents something my kind forgot. Compassion, determination, the willingness to help when helping is hard. The station had gone silent. Everyone listened. I will not hide anymore. I will travel this galaxy and share what my species learned before pride destroyed us. I offer knowledge to any who will listen and wisdom bought with the price of extinction. And I ask you to remember this human, who saved a dragon when every logical reason said not to. Roy climbed down from Thessara's back and stood on the docking arm. Through nearby viewports he could see faces staring at him, expressions of shock and disbelief and wonder. His supervisor was among them, mouth hanging open. I need to borrow some supplies, Roy called out, and maybe a new shuttle. Mine didn't survive the rescue operation. Someone laughed. Then someone else. Within moments, the communication channel filled with overlapping voices asking questions, making demands, requesting interviews. The galaxy was waking up to the return of something ancient, and Roy Fletcher stood at the center of it all. Thessara lowered her head beside him. Ready for what comes next? Roy thought about his daughter, about the stories he'd told her about brave dragons and the people who helped them. He thought about the scale in his pack carrying knowledge of millions of years. He thought about a galaxy that needed to learn from past mistakes before making its own. Ready, he said. Together, a human mechanic and the last star dragon faced a future neither of them had planned for, but both were determined to shape.